What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why no one scales because they quote unquote smart, and why systems over being smart allows you to then scale your operations on a day-to-day basis, and why talent is probably holding you back. So with these videos, the main mission, like always, is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that we're actively implementing in terms of mental models and frameworks, and how we're scaling those frameworks into the future. Also to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and be the chief problem solvers, and ultimately build back-end infrastructure while we're at it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically the people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively solving for, which is chaos, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So today's day 71. I am super excited. I cannot believe, that we've pushed so hard for 71 days, and I'm just super excited, to just dive into this one, because this is something that I have thought about, quote unquote, for some time. That, I've always thought that, hey, because I'm, someone says, hey, you're smart, you're automatically gonna scale. But I figured out that that's not always the case, because the trap of being, quote unquote, talented is that if you're used to being smart in the room, you're probably the bottleneck. And that's the truth, because you start to then say, hey, you can't scale insight, you can't outsource genius, and you can't clone your 10 out of 10 thinking even on a bad day. Ultimately understanding that, hey, the insights that you want to gain, that you ultimately want to, that you have on a day-to-day basis, you ultimately can't scale that. And you also ultimately can't, outsource your genius. You're the one of one person, or the one of one version of yourself, and you ultimately cannot outsource that. Even if you're the smartest person in the world, you can't outsource yourself, but rather you are one-on-one, you're one of one person. And you need to realize that hey, you can't clone your 10 out of 10 thinking even on a bad day. So then what ultimately can you do? Just understand that, hey, the truth that I found, at least through this, is saying, hey, being smart makes you lazy, ultimately because you say, hey, I'm the smartest person in the room, why do I need to work hard? Because my thinking is going to do everything for you. But ultimately, because you rely on output, not systems. Simply because you rely on day-to-day outputs, that hey, if my genius is increasing the flow of what it is that we're building today, then automatically you're going to say, hey, we're going to get these predictable outcomes into the future. But you're not relying on the entire system as a whole and saying, hey, I'm actively just implementing what it is that I'm doing in terms of my genius. But you can't scale that. You can't scale that even if you wanted to, because on a day-to-day basis, especially when you're building, a business, you're going to get to the point where you realize that, hey, your geniuses can only take you so far. And that's when you ultimately have to have these measures in place through systems, and ultimately understand that, hey, some founders burn out, structured founders scale, saying, hey, you need to introduce more structure into your daily life by incorporating an operating system. Like for me, I have my own internal operating system that guides what it is that I'm actively doing. So I have a Notion doc that has, my books, the books that I'm reading, my personal life, all of this that accumulates to who I am as a person. Basically my alchemy of self, you could think of it, is ultimately within this Notion doc. And I ultimately say, hey, this is my own personal OS that, has my structure of how I like to do things, and how I know that, hey, this is who I am and this is my operating system. Not because I'm smart, I'm not just gonna rely on it to say, hey, like, I'm the smartest person in the room, so I'm gonna figure that out. Because in many cases I found that, hey, if I felt like, hey, I was the smartest person in the room, then probably I was in the wrong room 100% of the time. And saying, hey, like I said, smart founders burn out, but structured founders scale. So saying, hey, if you want to chase, scale, then you ultimately have to incorporate more structure in terms of building this operating system, at least I believe. And saying, hey, the best founders that I know personally aren't always the smartest. They don't have to be saying, hey, I'm the smartest person in the room and that's why we're actively scaling. No, that's not the case. This basically comes down to structure, and building more structure around their life and how they are actively doing things is ultimately the source of moat that they take on a day-to-day basis. So basically they do one of these things, which is, one of them, if not all of them, which is, building repeatable loops, basically saying, hey, on a day-to-day basis, I'm going to be, structuring out my day like this, where the first hour I wake up, I'm just, handling client emails, and then ultimately from there, they just attack. Everyone has their own, way of doing things, and I have also my own way of doing things, but ultimately, that structure of saying, hey, they have repeatable loops to say, hey, each and every single day, I know how I'm going to be tackling problems and how I'm going to be structuring out my day, which ultimately gives them leverage as well. And saying, hey, they also ultimately have transferable systems, saying, hey, if they were to use this operating system for themselves in terms of, a Talent OS, for example, they can incorporate certain principles that they can transfer into their daily lives. So, for example, say time management. If they have a time management OS, they could also incorporate this time management OS in terms of, structuring out deadlines that they actively just, track time and ultimately make sure that projects are done on a day-to-day basis. And this is just something that, is super important as well, because the more you can just transfer these different systems that actually work, and you've proven that, hey, these systems actively work within my personal OS, you ultimately realize that, hey, it's not just a one system for one specific thing and that's the only thing that it works for. You can always just incorporate different nuggets and transfer them, because those transferable systems ultimately govern how your life is. For example, you can use first principles thinking as a mode of source, but also understand that, hey, first principles thinking is a problem solve basis, a mental model, but ultimately you can run first principles thinking not only in problem solving sense, you can also incorporate it into how you structuring out your daily lives. For example, saying, hey, if I ask, deep whys in terms of how am I structuring out my day, where's my bottleneck within my personal OS, and ultimately reason up from there to say, hey, what are the fundamental truths of who I am and how I manage my time, and then actively just reason up from there, you can basically just transfer that mental model into a different, into a different use case within your personal life. And then saying, hey, decision trees for their teams, basically creating decision trees to say, hey, we're basically going to be focusing on, structuring the mental models and frameworks, because I personally believe that the way that you think and the way that you structure and document decisions that you take ultimately creates a lot of value for the business into the future. Not only for the business, but for you as well, because if you're actively documenting the decisions that you take on a day-to-day basis, you can actively use these as a source of mode to say, hey, we didn't have enough XYZ data at that specific point, and that's why we didn't get this result that we were looking for. And if you're actively documenting that and you hold yourself accountable and say, hey, we messed up and this is the reason why we messed up, and you ultimately learn from that, you are ultimately just creating value that you can output into the future for yourself. And saying, hey, internal docs, not internal chaos, basically saying, hey, SOPs, those are super important standard operating procedures that you ultimately are just incorporating into your personal life as well as into the team. I like to write SOPs. I know it's like one of the most boring things for most people, but ultimately I believe there's a lot of leverage in having these SOPs, because they're basically plug and play playbooks that ultimately, if you have someone new on the team, they just look at the SOP and say, hey, this is how you actively running XYZ. Okay, cool, let's actively just implement the way that you've already been doing things, but also keep adding and refining to that SOP, because you don't want an SOP that you've built in 2019 and are using in 2020, but ultimately it hasn't been updated. I think even if it's just a small nugget of truth to say, hey, we have a V1 which is the ultimate source of truth, but then we have another which is a V1 Lite, which ultimately has the afterthoughts from the V1 that we've had, that we're actively just commenting and adding thoughts on, which is something that I've just actively just thought of now, funny enough, but I will take a look into surely just incorporating that in a different sense. So basically just having that, I think, is one of the most important things, that you're constantly just that you're constantly actively just updating this source of truth and making sure that you have the most reliable source of truth that you can actively pull from, and also make sure that the team is getting the work done that they need to get to get done on a day-to-day basis, and saying, hey, they're not trying to do it better, they're trying to never do it again. They just want to build once and make sure the machine runs, saying, hey, if you find yourself, and I found myself doing this on multiple occasions, doing the same thing over and over and over again, that's not the most efficient use of your time, and that is not the most efficient, way you could be, outputting for your personal life and your business, because you're doing the same thing over and over and over. Say, for example, you're inputting data each and every single day, but ultimately, just inputting that data, if you were to basically automate it, then say, hey, that time that you could have spent, that you spend 2 hours each and every single day just inputting data manually, now you can basically use this time to then, further your outreach strategies and better your marketing, or even lead your team better. And that ultimately just makes sure that you have a more effective use of your time, and not just burning the machine, but rather just also incorporating a lot more structure. And that structure is ultimately what's going to allow you to scale. Because you can be the smartest person, but if you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, and it's not moving you forward in your business, and there's no actual structure, it's gonna feel like it's gonna feel like you're building everything over and over again, which is one of the worst feelings, at least that I found in my life, where I was like, hey, I'm finding myself building the same thing over and over and over again. Why isn't this machine just running? Why aren't I, using this time that I'm using on this thing that I'm doing over and over again, rather into, bettering the outreach strategies, or even just speaking to more people that ultimately gets us more deal flow, and saying, hey, systems are intelligence on autopilot, reshifting the lens that you're looking at it as, and saying, hey, systems are the intelligence, but they're on autopilot. And what I mean by this is that being smart is fragile, because it's dependent on three things. It's dependent on your mood, most of cases. It's dependent on time, so saying, hey, the amount of time that you have on a day-to-day basis, and also saying, hey, it's distraction sensitive, to say, hey, even if you get distracted, you're ultimately, that smartness or that leverage that you have on a day-to-day basis basically, becomes negligible most of the cases, at least from what I've seen. And saying, hey, how can you actively, have these systems in place, or these intelligence in place, that also automatically work on autopilot, and saying, hey, how can I actively structure out my day to make sure that I'm getting the maximum output on a day-to-day basis, but not also burning yourself out, but also adding structure. Because I think structure is one of the most important tools that, you should have on a day-to-day basis. And that's why I always like to dive into Notion, even just the thought that I've had from past projects that I actively implement. And I think this is super important. One of the things that I do is that each and every single project, I do, so much documentation, that each and everything that I think, I would need into the future is already mapped out. The relationships, whether it's an ERD diagram, and just making sure that every single relationship within the system that we're building is mapped out. And also, after we've mapped out the relations and everything that we've done from the project, what were our past learnings after, the project is done, because those feedback loops are ultimately going to govern how we're going to be building into the future, which I believe is invaluable now and into the long term. But also realizing that, hey, this structure, by building systems, it doesn't, these systems, they don't ultimately care if you sleep for 4 hours. They don't care if you've had a bad call. They just run. They ultimately just run the machine, and running the machine through, structure is one of the most important assets that you can incorporate on a day-to-day basis, rather than just relying on saying, hey, I'm smart, I'll figure it out each and every single day. Because ultimately, just shifting the narrative from saying, hey, how can I actually, just focus on, the things that I need to do on a day-to-day basis, which is where I, have this concept of mine, which is operating systems. And through operating systems and not focusing on IQ, I think this is one of the most important, facets that can ultimately, increase the flow in which you do things, and also making sure that, hey, you're actively just getting things done in a structured manner. And this is saying, hey, you don't need more effort, you ultimately need a operating system. And what I mean by this is, like I said, I have my master OS operating system that I have for my personal self, that governs how, my relationships are with different people, and also making sure that, hey, like my friends, family, everything are all in one place, and the thoughts that I have on a day-to-day basis, the books that I'm reading, and also making sure that, hey, that the client projects that I have as well, they're also just, the afterthoughts as well are just documented there, so then I can also just ultimately get them and saying, hey, let's actively, just have this. But in an example, in the workspace like environment, this is having a hiring OS. So we've actively built a hiring OS where we basically have a form, and then that form basically populates, the database. Then ultimately from there generates a summary to say, hey, this is what this person or this candidate actively holds, and this is what we see them doing in the future. And also just generates a summary, and also having a content OS saying, hey, how can I actively structure these content videos in an operating system that is native to me, that is, unique to me, one of one, in the sense that, hey, we're not just, burning the machine each and every single time, but we're introducing structure in terms of saying, hey, each and every single video is documented for a specific purpose, and through that specific purpose we log it as well to say, hey, this video is going to do XYZ result into the future, which is ultimately going to help in XYZ area as well. And also saying, hey, client onboarding as well, how is our onboarding procedures from, first contact point to when we start working with them, and we give them the material to say, hey, thank you for joining with us, here's how we, implementing stage 1, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, just ultimately just, giving that to them through an operating system. And also the feedback loop OS, which is the chaos feedback cycle, which I like to talk about, to say, hey, we're actively, just taking a unique approach in terms of gathering feedback, because I think, feedback is one of the most important things. It could be wrong, it could be good, it could be bad, but ultimately that feedback, we need to have an operating system around it, because the operating system is kind of like the brain that ultimately houses how things are run and govern how the systems basically operate and are related to each other, which also ultimately means that, hey, you need to make sure that there's structure around this, because if you don't have that structure on a day-to-day basis, you're just constantly going to feel that, hey, you're just burning the machine by doing the same thing over and over and over, and not actually leveraging your smarts or your intelligence as well, but also just saying, hey, I have this natural intelligence or whatever you have, and saying, hey, how can I supplement this by adding, creating leverage for myself in the long run by building this, OS that ultimately allows you to scale into the future. And saying, hey, decision making OS, which is one of my favorite ones, and saying, hey, we have this decision making OS that says, hey, if we make XYZ decision and we get it wrong, this is then what we do. Because if we ultimately have these decision making OSs, we will also ultimately just making sure that, hey, each and every single day we are governing the way that, our structure is built around these different modes, whether it's hiring, client, hiring, content, onboarding, and feedback, and just ultimately the decision making OS, and we're ultimately just creating different operating systems so that we know how we're actively governing how we're building into the future. And also making sure that, hey, your operating system is your new IQ, replacing the IQ with with OS. And I think this is one of the most interesting things that I've always thought about, and I've always said it's always interesting to think about things in terms of operating systems, like your smartphone, for example, your Apple phone, to say, hey, your smartphone is a structured device. There's a lot of structure that happens on the back end, and how can we actively steal some playbooks through that ultimately means that, hey, what I saw, especially through that, when I asked that question, for me, it was basically asking what broke me through, which was basically, I stopped trying to be that guy, but rather I started building systems that scale without me, saying, hey, the iPhone that you have does not manually always need input to say, hey, each and every single day, it needs to, build this structure on its own. It already has this OS that ultimately governs how it functions. And ultimately saying, hey, documenting instead of deciding, I'm flipping the script and focusing on documenting instead of deciding, saying, hey, like, I'm just ultimately gonna say, hey, if I want to film a video, I'm gonna film a video, and not just spend time deciding about it, but rather delegating instead of debating. So instead of saying, hey, I want to debate on should we hire XYZ person, just hire it and just solve the problem right away, because you only move as fast as your slowest constraint. And that is something that I've been super bullish and deep into ever since we started these videos, and saying, hey, instead of designing, we need to make sure that we're designing instead of reacting. How can we actively just build those compounding elements that ultimately move the needle forward on a day-to-day basis through just action? And that action is ultimately going to make us and make sure that each and every single day we're pumping, and making sure that we're just getting stuff done, which ultimately gets us closer to the vision of Killer Chaos OS. But through that, it means that, hey, you are ultimately, making sure that that's how you make smart scale. You ultimately make your smart version of yourself scale, and also making sure that, hey, not by thinking faster but by thinking less. If you're actively spending less time, just pumping up the machine and tweaking and doing all these things, you have more time to form clarity, and through that clarity that you form, you can ultimately make better decisions in the future than you would have if you just constantly just refining the machine and working within the machine on a day-to-day basis by just manually doing the same thing over and over again, which, like I said, from the analogy standpoint, which is just manually inputting data rather than just automating that process, and just deleting certain parts as well that ultimately just need you to do it each and every single day, which I think, in the long run, it could make sure that, hey, you're building, but the clarity that you form if you just take a step back and are ultimately saying, hey, I need to take a step back, but ultimately from taking a step back, I'm forming the clarity that ultimately allows us to get to the next level. And this ultimately means that, hey, everyone wants to be seen as brilliant. I think, a lot of people want to be seen as smart, at least from my personal experience, but brilliance is often a bottleneck, in my opinion, that I've at least found, to say, hey, structure is scale. Ultimately, if you want a structure, you need to incorporate more scale in your personal or business life. And I think this is, just mandatory. Like, you need to have scale, and if you want to have scale, you need to have structure. That is just one of the things that you cannot escape, and you don't need more hacks. Like, you definitely do not need more hacks. You need more architecture, and this is something that I'm super bullish on and focusing in the long run, because in the long run, the structured founders beats the smart founder every single time. And I think this is evident, especially now in this new online space where each and every single person, like, you just see someone pop up each and every single day. It's not always because they're the smartest or they're the most intelligent. It's that, hey, they're the most structured and the most disciplined, and through that they're able to scale to the levels that they're able to scale. And through this, I think this is one of the most interesting things, just focusing less on saying, hey, I'm the smartest person, so I'm just gonna get everything done by myself. I think that is not the true way to scale. I think structure is one of the most important modes in if you do want to scale into the future. And I know into the future we're going to get so many things wrong, but we're also going to get some things right. But in order to have that sample space of what we're going to get right and what we're going to get wrong, we ultimately need to just take action, and action in many different forms through these videos, to build our thinking mode, to make sure that, hey, our most valuable asset right now is how we think, how we log decisions as well, and how we're just constantly making sure that each and every single day we are pushing the needle forward for Killer Chaos OS or Chaos Killer OS, and just making sure that we're creating as much value as we possibly can into the future. But that ultimately starts with making sure that the thinking part of it is ultimately super dialed, and then we can scale everything else. But if we don't take the time to make sure that each and every single part in terms of our thinking OS is super dialed, then ultimately into the future we could be building something that doesn't have a solid foundation in terms of thinking, and we could be just wasting time. And I don't want to do that. I want to use these videos as a platform to refine our thinking so that we can ultimately build right and create as much value into the future. Like I always say, we're going to get some things wrong, but ultimately we're just going to keep pushing the needle forward each and every single day. And the things that we do get right, we're ultimately, just going to be happy about it. The things that we're going to get wrong, we're just ultimately going to use them as data points to, build better into the future. And yeah, that's basically all I have to say. If you guys want to connect with me, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. Leave a comment if you guys want to chat, and I will see you guys in the next video.